Okay, I just started a recording. So the plan is to also have these presentations and videos online on the website like last year. So yeah, let's start. Welcome to the first parallel session actually of the ECMP 2022. And this one is chaired by the ECMF project. So that's the one that Will Usher presented already in the welcome session, where one of the goals is to have this kind of comparison of models, bridging European and national models, and doing also performing diagnostic analysis and exercises and multimodal comparisons in an aim also to kind of help, let's say, defragmentizing, if you wish, the European energy modeling community. So we have 4 speakers with, I think, very related topics. Very happy for, I think, a very consistent session. So without further ado, Robert Pietzker will be the first speaker from the Potsdam Institute. And yes, so he will present one of the works that we have been doing within the ECMF on multimodal comparisons and model diagnostics applied to the EU. So I think a great and very relevant topic to this conference. So Robert, I hope you can share the screen. Yes, perfect. Thanks a lot. And the floor is yours. We have 2 hours, so the idea is more or less, maximum half an hour per presentation. So yeah, but if let's say 15 to 20 minutes presentation, or even a bit less, then we have time enough for discussion. Would be great. Thanks.
Thanks, Johannes, for your kind introduction. Can you hear me well?
Yes.
Great. So I will present some first results and insights from the ECMF project, the European Climate and Energy Modeling Forum, specifically about diagnostic multi-model intercomparison exercise to inform new climate neutrality pathways. This talk is put together by colleague Renato Rodriguez and myself, and it builds on the work of all the ECMF teams that contribute to work package 1. So to start, the trillion euro question is how to get to net zero by 2050. We're trying to help with this question. And I would like to briefly motivate why, even though we're in the middle of a huge energy crisis, and the question how we get over the next winter and the winter after is like pressing on all minds and all executive people who actually have to do something about this, I still would say it's really important to address this trillion euro question on net zero now, and to improve our knowledge. Well, the reasons for this are manifold. One is there is a EU climate law that creates a legally binding obligation to reduce greenhouse gas emissions to 0 by 2050. So we have really a stringent requirement to get there. And then we know from, well, looking at today where we are and what we have seen in the energy transformation over the last decade and decades is that infrastructure buildup and technology scale up have really long inertia, like decade long. We're talking about 10, 15, 20 years to really transform a system. And with the current energy crisis that is so extreme and that creates so extreme measures to curb it, it is there now and it likely won't be over in 1 or 2 years. And so we better make sure that these hundreds of billions of euros that we spend on curbing the crisis and try to get over the next winters are really in line with the long-term transformation needs towards net zero. Because once we spend those billions, they won't come back. And if we spend them wrongly, then we really have some problems. So some research and innovation gaps on net zero that we identified are that there are some studies, but it's mostly single model or even single sector studies that look at very specific aspects of how to get to net zero, but not much overall literature that is really scanning, that really compares how different models see the approaches. And much of the publications until now are gray literature, so put forward by NGOs, by the EU Commission, or by industry lobbies. And this is really important to further knowledge, but it would be also good if science steps up here and provides coordinated insights. And there have been some ex post comparisons of these existing studies, because as I said before, you usually have only one model producing a study or producing an insight. And then you have a next study coming up with a very different result, and it's difficult to compare. There has been an exercise by JRC, for example, on comparing those net zero studies. But if you go at it after the studies have been published, like ex ante, just looking at the results, it's quite challenging to really understand what's driving the results and how plausible you would value one study against the other. And also what we see is that there's quite some inconsistency between the EU level net zero scenarios and what individual member states are proposing in their NECPs, for example. And so there's quite some disconnect there. So what we think is missing is a coherent evidence base about net zero pathways. It gives us insights about robust technology choices, about 2030 and 2040 milestones, and about trade-offs between alternative pathways. And our aim is to provide this evidence base and close some of these research gaps by conducting a model intercomparison exercise and not on net zero pathways. And I put here open in brackets, because while currently it's within the ECMF consortium, we have the plan to open this up and invite other teams to join in this in the next months. Now, when you want to provide insights about how to get to net zero, the first really important step is to start with diagnostic scenarios. Why? Because if you talk about net zero, it really there are two very large challenges to the models and the modelers. First of all, to cite Timmermans, climate neutrality is going to be bloody hard. So it's really requiring a full
You're muted, Robert.
Thanks. Since when?
Like 15 or 20 seconds when you.
Okay.
Since bloody hard.
Okay. Automatic censorship here in this. Okay, so as I said, it's going to be very, very hard. It requires full transformation of all sectors, and it goes much beyond what most integrated assessment models and energy system models have been providing as scenarios over the last decade. So it's really stretching what the models can do to the limits. And secondly, as we're in the midst of the transformation, there's a really high level of detail needed, because we're not talking anymore about some very rough abstract numbers, but concretely about the amount of heat pumps to put on the ground, or how many megatons of hydrogen to import, where policymakers and industry representatives are really like, they know the numbers because they're in the middle of investing and in the middle of acting on this. So this stretches also what IMs were used to do in the past, where you talk about global numbers and long-term targets. So how to go about this? Well, our approach, and I think our approach is to challenge the models with diagnostic scenarios. And I say here actually extreme diagnostic scenarios, because if you want to get reasonable results from your model in like a normal net zero scenario, then you first want to make sure it's still roughly okay if you go a bit further, to make sure that your normal scenarios are fine. And then you look at these results, compare between the models, and then compare to detailed sectoral and topical modeling. And that's really one of the advantages of ECMF, because we have work packages that do demand sector modeling explicitly, so with very high detail models that look explicitly at infrastructure buildup and sector coupling, and another work package also dealing with consumer behavior. So the idea is to take your full system model, take the smaller models and compare the results, and then hopefully improve in the next step and update your full system models, and then repeat until you are happy with the results, and that you actually can explain what your model is doing and find the results reasonable. And then from that next step, then to derive insights on net zero runs, and hopefully also in ECMF, as we want to bring the energy modeling community a bit closer, provide infrastructure to other teams so that they can also do their diagnostic scenarios and compare and learn from this. Now, let me briefly give a scenario and model overview here. So we have a number of policy scenarios. So one is like national policies implemented, what you would take as a reference scenario. You just take what's there on the ground, and then as a current driving scenario, we have a carbon price, increasingly CO2 price, scenario here, you see the numbers on the right side. So very ambitious, but well in line with what we've seen in previous studies as required to get to net zero. Then we have several technology constraint scenarios where we limit certain technologies and some paradigm shift scenarios, because over the last years we've really seen like it's not just some minor changes about a little bit more of one energy carrier, a little bit less of the other, but we're in the middle of a full transformation where the whole structure can be shaken up. So we try to drive the models into extreme points there and then compare to how this looks compared to detailed modeling on this. We have a number of full system models and a few power sector models that contribute to this. And if I just give you a few snapshots of what we found until now. So for example, this is the CO2 price that we put in white. You see the historic ETS prices, and then what we assumed as a simple linear path to drive the models. And we find that on the right side, industry over time, you find that this CO2 price brings most models close to zero CO2 emissions from energy and industry in 2050. So they all go 90%, some even below zero, but they're all in this range close to zero at the moment. This, however, is not enough to get the models to net zero in the way that it's formulated in the climate law, because if you want to go to net zero greenhouse gases, you have in the models that do non-CO2 gases, you have these CH4, N2O, and some F gases remaining. And they can be reduced, but there's currently very little, or there's nobody says that they can really be reduced to zero, like CH4 from agriculture or N2O from agriculture. And so you need to have actually negative CO2 emissions to be able to get to climate neutrality. And so we have to be, in the next scenarios, we will push a bit harder on the models to see if we can get closer to that. Then just picking up one of the key questions that is, I think, debated in every sector, how much should I get feedback? It would be nice if that person could turn off their mic. Is the question about electricity or hydrogen, or electricity and hydrogen. And so if we simply look in the shares that either electricity or hydrogen have in final energy in our C400 scenarios, I mean, they start off with close to zero for hydrogen and close to 20% for electricity. And then you see both increase, but you clearly see a difference. Whereas hydrogen goes to roughly 4%, so 0 to 10 if you take the 25 to 27 percentile. So it increases by about 4 percentage points. Electricity goes up to around 50% here. So that's plus 30% against percentage points against today. So while scaling up hydrogen is important, like this, there are some sectors we really can't do without. But we should not forget that electrification is a much more important and much larger transformation, because to get these plus 30 percentage points of final energy, there's a huge number of heat pumps, a huge number of electric vehicles or electric trucks and new industry processes that you need to put on the ground. So we really shouldn't forget about that. You can zoom in a little bit more into the different sectors. So these are, again, the shares of electricity or hydrogen in the three demand sectors, and lots to see in there and discuss there. Like very few robust insights, for example, that none of the models see any reasonable share of hydrogen in buildings being used. I think it's really important to focus on the other where there's some need that several models see. Secondly, if you look at electrification, it's really transport is undergoing the strongest increase of all the sectors. But I mean, this is just the first step. The next step that we now have to take now is take the work package 2 scenarios from the sectoral models and then hold them side by side to the full system models and compare what is plausible and what is not plausible, and then adjust the models if we find the stories by the sectoral models convincing. Now, where does all the electricity that is either used directly or indirectly if transformed to hydrogen, where does it come from? Very, very clear answer. The main pillar is wind and solar. So you see here the share of wind and solar in electricity generation in our main scenario, and this goes to 58 to 83% of electricity generation. Now, funnily, or maybe not funnily, because we've seen this in 5 years ago in the advanced project, but it repeats again and again, that usually the model with the highest temporal and regional detail often has the highest wind and solar share. So while usually it says, well, integration is the main challenge, it doesn't always seem the case that if you go into more detail, it becomes more challenging, but rather that actually you can represent the integration possibilities better. Just one other short observation here. This is nuclear electricity generation from the models. And while there have some models see some slight investment in between, in the long term, they all end up lower than 2010 electricity generation. So the maximum that was seen until now. So according to our standard scenario, yeah, this is not a major expansive expansion in Europe needed to achieve net zero. Now, briefly touching upon two key uncertainties that we observe. One is CCS, where if you plot carbon capture and storage over time, you really see very, very, very fast and high upscaling of CCS. So up here, 1,700 or so, that's a third of current emissions. That seems quite impressive. So I think we'll have to look a bit into the growth rates. We do have a limited CCS scenario where we limit a maximum CCS to 250 megatons. So this line down here. And if we then look at total emissions in 2050 between all the scenarios that are free, all the scenarios where CCS is limited, we do see only a limited amount increase of total emissions, 200 to 350 megatons. So there is quite some flexibility there. Some models like to use CCS, but if they can't, it's also not too much of a problem for that. And similarly for biomass, we also have some models that really increase biomass use by a factor 2 or 3 compared to today. And that clearly brings with it sustainability questions. So we then challenge the models, what happens if we limit biomass to 7.5 exajoule, which was like a result of a JRC study trying to determine sustainable biomass use in the EU. And then similarly, we see some increase of our emissions, but again, not huge. So 200 to 400 megatons of CO2. And we'll look further into this. With this, I come to a close. I don't think I need to repeat the point I want to make. The one thing, two things I want to mention is really, it helped, like the discussions between the modelers helped a lot for the different teams in updating their renewable potentials, their assumptions about how much biomass can be imported and so on. So I really think that's the main benefit of this, one of the main benefits of these model comparison exercise. And finally, if you want to join our diagnostics with your model, please contact us at info@ecmf.eu. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Robert. Great presentation, very concise. And yeah, sorry for the hiccup. I muted you. I wanted to remove the voice from another. Okay, great. Thanks a lot. Yeah, I'm happy to have questions. I think, yeah, you can all write them in the chat, but I think we also have time for our interventions with like 40-ish people, so that should be feasible. So, yeah, please write in the chat if you have a question, and or you can also unmute yourself and put the question online. I think it's possible.
Yeah, maybe directly oral is faster than typing.
Yes, I agree. So please don't be shy. We have we should have 10 minutes. So. And I second the call also that, yeah, especially that other models are invited to also to follow the public protocol, which you have on our website on the ECMF. And so joining other models with European or national focus, I think would be, yeah. Please send the email as he said, or contact us personally.
So I would have a question. Thanks for the presentation. You said that you have a higher share of renewables in the models that have a higher spatial and temporal resolution. I wondered if you understand why, or what are the processes that cause this?
Yes. So it is a at the most observation, and it's not like a direct relationship. Every like a little bit more detail and a little bit more VRE. I think the main reason is when you start a very detailed, when you build a very model on temporal and spatial resolution, you think about the challenge of integrating wind and solar, and then you put effort into actually implementing storage and other effects. Whereas if you have a full system model that was built 15 years ago, where wind and solar were nice but not like the key question, you usually you make some very harsh assumptions on, well, you can't go above 50%, or as integration, like in our model we have in the default setting, like we have a detailed setting, but the default setting is you have integration costs that rise with share, and then you parameterize them according to some scenario runs with a very detailed model. But that happened 5 years ago, so they're also not taking into account all the updates on technology costs, on battery costs, and so on, and on demand side flexibility. So it's usually the more detail you have, the more effort you put into representing integration options, and therefore you show that it's possible. Yes, on the limits to, or like there's a question in the chat on how we arrived at the biomass and CCS limits. So for the this was actually there were some discussions. Yes, for the biomass, we settled on the JRC sustainable biomass use in Europe study. I think from 2018. Like we looked a bit around, and yes, there are many numbers out there, and that study has a low, a medium, and a high value, and we decided to take the medium value of that. So I think biomass sustainability is a very difficult question, and so we decided to pick that. On the CCS, it's also not much, or no, it's not much better. It's actually worse. So there. Sorry, I have to admit, I honestly currently forgot how we set that the 250 megatons bound exactly. I think it was based on some previous modeling where it found like as a lower limit to where you could get with. Yeah, no, sorry, I'll have to check this and contact you later. And for CCS, it's really, we see it is not scaling up at all, or very slowly. So accordingly, knowledge about storage quantities and is also not progressing, because there's simply not much money currently being spent. So I think we have to live for another 5 years at least with this uncertainty where it can go. And I think you could also do a run with 100 megatons, and that would show you, yes, it gets even a little bit harder, but I don't expect huge effects there.
Thanks. There's a second question by Mark in the chat on the differences between in terms of negative emissions in the $400 scenario. I think you
yes. So here, well, so actually, I would say the difference are quite limited, right? One gets slightly bit below zero for the CO2 emissions.
But there was a slide one further, I think. Yeah, this one.
Sorry, that actually. So I think 100 megatons or so are negative emissions from energy and industry, and then in this current reporting, Riemann is the only one that also has negative afforestation emissions counted in. So that's why we're so much below here. I mean, I think some of the models don't represent that, so one could draw in another 100 to 300 megatons dashed box down here.
From units, I know it's in there, but it's probably not happening with the 400 tax yet. So I wonder if there's probably a large difference then in the costs of these measures.
And to understand, you would say that the LULUCF, negative LULUCF emissions are more expensive or less expensive?
Yeah, well, at least, yeah, they probably need, relative to other technologies, they're more, well, they seem more expensive than an image. But I'm not sure if that's the case, but that looks, if I look to this picture, it does.
Yeah. Well, I think like the other models simply don't include it to my current knowledge. So we're still looking into this. So
Okay.
Don't name me down this. Like when I speak with our land use modelers, they say, well, actually many of the land use change emission reductions, they could be quite cheap, like from an actual cost perspective, but they're hugely expensive from the institutional perspective.
Yes.
How to actually get them incentivized and monitored and make sure you don't give any wrong incentives there. So I think that's why a substantial part of this is usually left out of the cost optimization. And simply done via assumptions whether this is possible to put on the ground or not. Yeah, but I'm not the land use modeler, so I would have to go back to my colleagues for more details on that.
Yeah.
And I mean, the EU is assuming minus 250 to minus 400 megatons CO2 from land use change until 2050, if you look into the long-term strategy.
Yeah.
And I think that's a bit on the high side compared to what other people say on this, or like the Grassi paper says as likely take up of natural forests due to higher CO2 concentrations. But as said, I'm not the expert on this.
Yeah, that's also different. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, maybe I can have a question on my own. So, which is, I think the framework is very, very useful, and I wonder what is kind of the what other questions or issues to look into this protocol and this analysis could be used for instance, let's say energy trade or something like that. The question, I mean, should we consider also looking in other dimensions rather than the ones that you presented, which are already very big? But yeah, there's a lot of results there, right? So the question, I mean, what might be other questions for which this harmonized protocol and analysis is relevant? As a more comment, or I don't know if you have thought about it, but I think also in light of the plenary of all the relevant topics related to, let's say, energy, trade, and others, if this could be used to inform that, I think many models would have it, right? So the question just if you want to do something also in the direction of, let's say, trade or energy security based on these scenarios.
I would say we should look into it, but I can't promise anything. I think for trade, the challenge is that this requires your model to also have the other world regions relatively well represented and to make strong assumptions. So I think something that in ECMF Workpack 5 will push forward a bit more, and I think we'll compare some basic assumptions, but this won't be an in-depth part. On the energy security, which is closely linked, like we do some analyses at PIC, and I know the challenges because once you increase it to this global question, you immediately open up the amount of parameters and things you have to fix, and that strongly determine your results, like what strength of climate mitigation do you assume for the rest of the world, that can strongly drive how much biomass or hydrogen is available at what price for import or not. And I think it's important to follow up on these questions, but at the same time, in this concrete example, we already have so many questions. I feel a bit stretching thin if we just put more and more and more on top of it. So I would rather say that the connection to the crisis is rather via which infrastructure is needed beyond 2030, and that could influence investments that are taking place now in the next years.
Yeah, makes sense. But maybe future follow-up work. Anyhow, well, thanks a lot. I think really great works and very promising, Robert. So let's move to the next speaker, which is very much related, which is by Mark Decker from PBL, also within the ECMF project. But here the focus is a bit more on what was already discussed, the model differences. And here with the method of looking at how different models can be characterized using things like diagnostic indicators. So, Mark, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you. Can you see my screen?
Yes. Thanks a lot.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, so thank you. My name is Mark Dekker. I'm a postdoc at the Netherlands Environmental Assessment Agency, PBL, and affiliated to Utrecht University. And I'm working in the same project, basically, as Robert, also using many of the same scenarios. So it's actually a nice combination that we have here. And I'm more, whereas Robert is more focused on, in his presentation at least, on the actual numbers of reaching to climate neutrality and the trade-offs between hydrogen and electricity. I'm more focused on just comparing the models in general, and in particular, how I call it, characterization of energy models. Perhaps first a little bit about why I think this is important. You might have all encountered it. Reading two papers on the same topic, but where different models are used, yielding different outcomes, perhaps even qualitatively different outcomes. And in itself, it's not a problem that there are model differences, because there are different energy futures possible, and the richness of model differences actually allow us to get a grasp on this future. But of course, if you read a single result, a single number from a model, it is always, it can be very confusing on why it differs with another model. In that sense, it's very important to sketch a context of each model. Is a model particularly optimistic about VRE, for example, or a model particularly dependent on CCS technologies in the future to get climate neutrality, for example? So these kind of contexts are, I think, very important for both policymakers as well as scholars to be able to interpret results well. So that, so that is kind of the effort today. And it's under the umbrella of the ECEMF again. And as Robert already said, the protocol for all these scenarios is available online, and it's an invitation to all to contact ECEMF, me, Robert, or whatever, to if you want to join this model comparison effort. Then the main question of today is how to characterize energy models. And for now, I focus on three very basic questions on where I will compare the models. The first one is how much mitigation is taking place in general. It's about sensitivities, sensitivity to pricing, but also sensitivity to these constraints that Robert also talked about earlier already. The second question is, how are these emissions mitigated? Is it because of reductions in energy or gains in efficiency? Or is it because of changes in the carbon intensity? And the third question is, where in the energy system do we find these transformations? So that's really about the electricity mix, end-use sectors, etc. Before I dive into the results, again, about this diagnostic exercise, we have 10 models here. Let me get the laser pointer. 10 models here, and a lot of different scenarios. But for the purpose of this presentation, I only zoom into the scenarios that have a linearly increasing carbon price, and on top of that, some additional conditions. So as Robert said, we have a few where there are technological constraints on, for example, CCS potential, on biomass, etc. And there are a few about paradigm shifts where we specifically boost VRE or efficiency gains, etc. So, and I think that makes this diagnostic exercise very interesting from a model comparison perspective, that we cannot only measure price sensitivities, but also sensitivities of models versus these limits, versus particular VRE prices, etc. So much more than only comparing carbon price differences. Okay, so back to these questions. We dive into the first question about how much mitigation is taking place. I will present most of the results like this. So for each of the models, they are in colors. We have a thick dot, which is the standard linearly increasing carbon price scenario. So the one that Mark Roofsema earlier also asked about, this $400 scenario. And then adjacent to that thick dot, you have these smaller dots, which are all these variations, the ones with technological constraints, the ones with paradigm shifts, etc. So that you can basically see the jump of each model as a consequence of this extra condition in these panels. Okay. So first, how to read these plots. So on the vertical here, I have the relative abatement index, which is just the percentual decrease in emissions with respect to the baseline. And on the horizontal, I have the amount of years after 2020 it takes to get 60% reduction in CO2 emissions. By the way, all the results that I'm showing, unless stated otherwise, are about CO2 emissions from energy and industrial processes, are from 2050 and for Europe. And on the right here, I have just CO2 emissions over time for the baseline scenarios here, and in dashed lines for these standard carbon price scenarios. And you see a number of things already in this panel. So you see, for example, that Remind has above 1 relative abatement, pointing towards their negative emissions in 2050 already. And you see, for example, here, Which in green, that they have a relatively small abatement relative to the ensemble, but quite fast in terms of this first surge of 60% reduction. But also you see that all these variations, these paradigm shifts, these technological constraints actually do not affect the results of Which much. That's also interesting. So these smaller dots are very close to the thick one. While for Image, for Prometheus in yellow, and for Time ECN in darker blue, you see that these variations have a very profound effect on the place in this panel. The next step to analyze these results is to compare explicitly particular paradigm shift scenarios to what they do with the model results. So, for example, if you look at the scenario where we specifically boost high efficiency, you see that it leads to more abatement and also faster abatement here in Remind. But also for Image, you see also it goes to the top left. You also see it for Time ECN, and you see that also in yellow here for Prometheus, which yields graphs like this, where you basically just look at the displacement of these special scenarios with respect to the base carbon price scenario. You see indeed for high efficiency, if you boost that, you see that for all models, abatement is gained, and also the speed at which this first 60% is reached is also gained. But for example, if you limit the potential of biomass, actually the effect on the model results in terms of a general mitigation is not conclusive. You see that for different models, there's a different reaction to this biomass limit. And for CCS, if you limit that, you see that it generally decreases abatement in 2050, but it doesn't do much for the first 60% reduction in terms of the speed, which is natural because we also expect that CCS is not very important in this first surge of mitigation. Okay, so these are some first concepts about model sensitivity and mitigation in general. And the second question was, how are emissions mitigated? And then I will focus here on three things. On the vertical here, I have the reduction in final energy in 2050 with respect to the base scenario. On the horizontal here, the reduction in carbon intensity. And here I have a separate plot on the carbon capture over time. This data that Robert also showed before. You see a couple of things again here, differences and similarities. You see that Prometheus here is clearly dominating the final energy reduction signal, having twice as much final energy reduction as some of the other models. You also see that limiting the biomass, limiting CCS has a profound effect on the carbon intensity in this model. And you see for a Remind, you see it again having a very high carbon intensity of above 1, again depicting these negative emissions that they have in 2050. And you see again that which, and now also remind message, sorry, have a very small area in this graph. Again, these extra conditions and paradigm shift have a small effect on this on these models. Also, what you see is that limiting CCS and limiting biomass for most models just make the position in this graph go left, and so they do not really indirectly affect a final energy reduction much. You see lim bio, lim CCS all to the left of their main dot, but not having a very strong vertical displacement. So this is a bit about how the different models situate towards each other with respect to how mitigation is reached. Then the third question about where then in the energy system do we see the transformations? Of course, you can already expect there are large model differences there. We will focus on the electricity mix first. And let's focus on this left panel about 2030. I plot them in triangular form, where you have as a vertical ordinate using this axis fossil use in electricity. On this axis, you have other sources of electricity, so biomass and nuclear. And on the horizontal axis, going towards 100%, is VRE. So note the axis, this is 0 to 50 for fossil, 0 to 50 for the other, and 50 to 100 for VRE. And you see in 2030 already that there's kind of a grouping or a spreading of the models already. You see a group of models with about 55% VRE and a group of models with about 75% VRE. Already in 2030, there's a strong dispersion of these different models. And this is just these main pricing scenarios. And if you then also include these additional constraint scenarios, you get a picture like this for 2050. And the first observation, it is all over the place. And let's first have a small look at the main, say the reference carbon price scenario, so the thick dots. And there you see that the differences are between, 50% VRE to almost 100% VRE. So very strong differences in the electricity mix. You see image going up here, which is more reliant than other models on fossil with CCS. And you also see that for some models, especially the models with lower VRE, that they are very sensitive to these paradigm shifts assumptions and these technology constrained assumptions. So diving a little bit more into these specific scenarios, I made these plots where you, for a few, so here the one limiting the biomass, limiting CCS, promoting electrification and promoting VRE, where you only see that extra scenario added to the panel. And in arrows here, I basically point out what the general tendency is of what this constraint or paradigm shift does with the position of these models in the electricity mix diagram. So you see, if you limit biomass, models tend to be more dependent on fossil use. If you limit CCS, you see quite some of the models going into the VRE direction. But the strongest, say, jumps you see in the bottom two, where if you promote electrification, there's a few strong jumps towards fossil dependency in electricity. And if you promote VRE, of course, a lot of going into the, of course, expected VRE corner, with notably a few very large jumps from Prometheus, Time ECN, and META, which does show that these models can reproduce an energy economy like this. So that's an interesting finding, I think, in itself. Okay, so that about transformations of the electricity mix. Now, one final result slide on end-use sectors. I only have transport and industry here, but I have buildings in the appendix if anyone wants to see that later. You see, again, very strong model differences. For transport in 2050, you see some models between 50, 60, or even 70% fossil use in transport, while image and remind here have approximately 70% electricity. in 2050. So with this very same carbon pricing, you also see that these extra constraints do not do that much, with the outlier being time ECN here. I annotated the high electrification scenario specifically to investigate this, and you see that it doesn't do much. While if you go to industry, you see that the dots are generally a bit closer together, but these constraints have much higher impact. So in a sense, you could say that the high electrification scenario is not just a general high electrification scenario, but is kind of a high electrification in industry scenario. So you see that specifically for that scenario, there are a lot of jumps into this corner. Okay. So we've talked a lot about model differences, but also some model alliances. And now again, about this very first question I posed on model characterization. Can we somehow work towards that? Well, it's good to know that this is still work in progress. But these three questions, these are three very basic questions. Of course, you can ask many more, but I keep it to this now. Kind of form a three-dimensional imaginary space. Yeah, so this first question about how much mitigation relates to sensitivities. Is your model very sensitive to pricing, or do these boundary conditions and paradigm shifts also play a large role in your position of the model? Another axis about the second question, about the means. Is it about carbon intensity changes, or do efficiency gains play a large role in your model? And the third about transformations. Do we see that mainly in electrification, or are hydrogen, biomass, CCS, are those dependencies also there? And it's of course all relative to the ensemble, but I would like to give two examples, and then I will close my presentation. So how could you think about this? So let's focus on the Witch model for now, for example. We have seen that the Witch model was in dark green, was always quite confined in each of these panels. These constraints, paradigm shifts, etc., didn't play a very large role, which may point towards that the carbon pricing was very dominant in determining the results, and the other conditions less so. We also saw in this panel that that they were pretty low in terms of the final energy reductions predicted. So they were mainly dependent on carbon intensity reductions. And we also saw in the electricity mix that they were very positive about, or very optimistic about VRE changes, and less so about other or fossil with CCS. So that would place Witch kind of in this corner of this three-dimensional space. So this is something that you perhaps can imagine, and something that that we will develop in the coming months and try to quantify as well. Another example would be Prometheus, which is kind of at the other end. We've seen that Prometheus was very prone to all these extra constraints and paradigm shifts. You see it here in the final energy versus carbon intensity reduction space. You see that it has a very large area covered. You see that's very dependent on these efficiency gains. It was dominating that signal out of all models. Most final energy reduction was predicted there. And we've also seen in the electricity mix that it is more dependent on biomass and nuclear than other models. So these kind of characterizations are, I think, very important to be aware of when interpreting the results of respectively Witch and Prometheus. If you are aware of that, you can place it in some kind of context. And that is, I think, the ultimate goal of this work. And so we will proceed with this in the coming months. And yeah, I'm happy to hear your thoughts. That was my presentation. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Mark. Thanks. Great presentation as well. Yeah, we have time for discussion, both potentially from the demand side, let's say the policy side, or fellow researchers, modelers. Please, yeah, speak up or write the question in the chat. But we have times. There's a question of whether this work has been published yet.
No. Actually, it's still ongoing, as I said. So Yeah, ultimately there are a lot of thoughts, but ultimately I would try to develop this what I talked about in the last few slides about this actual characterization, develop that a little bit more, and also broader than only these scenarios with this linear carbon price. So we also have scenarios on net zero, we have a baseline scenario. Those are also things that may characterize a model. So we shouldn't blindly only look at results with a high carbon price to characterize an energy model. So it has to be broadened a little bit still. And of course, ultimately, ideally, be also quantified, this position in this three-dimensional space, or even perhaps multi-dimensional space. So that, yeah.
I have a question then, Mark. Thanks for the presentation. I really like the sensitivities. It gives a lot of information, sometimes too much for a quick presentation.
I realized that.
Interested in the Q1, what is about mitigation. There you show, I think, 60% reduction and an index. How sensitive is this for example, if you take 70% reductions and 2040 abatement?
Yeah.
Does that make any difference?
I will show the slide again for everyone to follow this. So it's about this horizontal axis. Yes, it's a good question. So ultimately, what I wanted to capture here is kind of the initial speed towards which of the models react to carbon pricing. And on the vertical, you have, say, the absolute total reaction, total sensitivity, but then you can also have a reactivity, you could almost call it, of the models. And there are different ways of quantifying it. In ECEMF, we also have a shock scenario where we wait a little bit with no carbon price and then suddenly jump with the carbon price and then go on. So we can also quantify it comparing those results with the general carbon price scenario. However, we do not have that shock for each of these special scenarios, and that is why I didn't use that here. And then your question is about the exact number here. Yeah, so if you make this number too small, then the resolution on this horizontal scale becomes very low, because this is simply in years after 2020. So if you go to 40 or 50%, the resolution becomes low and you see a lot of dots under each other, and it becomes less quantifiable anymore, because we all know these results are on a yearly resolution. And I expect that, for example, if you look at the LIM CCS scenario, which is actually almost inert with respect to this speed metric, because CCS is simply not that important yet in the first 60%, I expect that if you make this much larger, towards, say, 90% or so, that you will see some kind of resolution here. Because then in the last X percent, CCS does start playing a role. So these are some thoughts about the thing that you asked about. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I think it would be interesting to see if the whole picture changes for certain. But that's actually what you explained, for example, CCS very well. Thanks.
Yeah. I did try several values actually. In the end, I just put this one in. But these are some trade-offs in presenting this well. Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
I would have a question or a comment. So thanks first of all for this great presentation. So it's quite interesting to see all these sensitivities, and it absolutely makes sense to first characterize the models a bit before maybe going into this deeper analysis. I was wondering about two things. The first thing would be, for all this, you need a baseline scenario, probably, because that would be the scenario with zero carbon prices or with low carbon prices. And also some of your plots, they depend on a baseline scenario, like reductions relative to a baseline scenario. Was there some common protocol to define the baseline scenario, how it should look like? Because I imagine if different models see their baseline scenario or their current policy scenario already quite differently, then also their carbon pricing scenarios will be different, and that's already a kind of first difference that you would get, that maybe doesn't necessarily have to do with the model structure. And then the second point, I think it's more of a comment question. So do you see any way to to kind of take into account, or to assess a bit the focus of each of the models? So if you, for example, ask the modeling teams, okay, what do you think is the strength of your model? Where do you put a lot of effort in which part? Is it industry? Is it CDR or something else? Kind of to understand your results better, or to order the results better, when you say, okay, like this model has spent a lot of work on this aspect, so this is kind of more more credible source or something like this. So do you see any potential in this?
Yeah, great questions. Thank you. So first about the baseline. Yeah, this is a very actually I had this discussion a lot internally here, but also within the project meetings. That you see a lot of baseline differences already. I've shown this picture also where you saw the baselines, some of the baselines actually going down over the century, and some of the baselines in terms of emissions going up for some models. Alternatives. First, the baseline scenario that we use is just a scenario with no policy. So that's how we defined it. There is also in the ECMF protocol a scenario where we implement current policies only, but there are a lot of differences in this implementation. If you look at the output of that scenario, it goes in very different directions. Some modelers only implementing short-term policies and then going up again in terms of emissions, while others somehow linger some policies. So therefore, there would be a preference of using the actual baseline scenarios with no policies at all. And of course, alternatives would be to calculate indicators as a fraction or a change with respect to the 2020 values. So that's also a possibility. But then it depends on what you're after. So if you're really after the sensitivity of pricing itself, then if you go from a baseline that goes actually up over the century towards very deep because of the pricing, then that is also something that you want to capture in your metric. That you go from a base that would otherwise go up very, very deep down. So actually, that there are baseline differences in that sense does not matter. But it's indeed a very important and active discussion to think of what would be the best reference to compare to. So that's about the first. And the second about asking modeling teams on strengths and weaknesses of the models themselves. I think that's very important. So as soon as we have some kind of say first iteration of such model characterization, and the fact, for example, that Prometheus you see such much lower VRE than models like Remind and Witch, that says something about, of course, what's underneath the model, and it could be a particular emphases in the model, and that's something that I would ask the teams themselves for, because I, of course, do not have all that knowledge in my head. So yeah, definitely a very good suggestion, and definitely also something that we aim to do when we start actually interpreting where these things come from. And perhaps to add to that, ultimately, I'm also interested in looking at whether there are certain not biases, but impacts of the type of modeling. So there are supply side models, there are full system models in here, there are general equilibrium models, there are simulation-based models versus optimization models in there. So can we see some relations there? There's been previous research on this before, but not very clear outcomes. That's also something I am interested in. Yeah. Any other questions, perhaps?
It seems Johannes is gone.
I was looking for you.
Sorry, it's muted. Sorry, it was muted. Sorry, my bad. There's a switch. There's two switches. Yeah, no, I was just saying, yeah, if there's another question, but otherwise we can also have it at the very end. I think the next talk is also very much related to the last point, the different types of models. So maybe we can move to the next speaker, which is Stratos Mikropoulos from Utrecht. So not so far geographically. And it's also on model comparisons, and especially the difference between different model types, as I understand it, energy system, IEMs, etc. So I hope you can share your screen.
Yeah, let me try. Can you see my screen?
Yes, perfect. Great.
Okay, nice. And then name was on point. Thank you for that. And I'm not part of the ECMF, but interesting enough, I'm a colleague of Mark because we both work under Image. So this is a coincidental nice transition there. So my name is Stratos Mikropoulos, and under the Sentinel project, we and the combined work of Utrecht University and the Imperial College, we made an intercomparison analysis between Sentinel models, but also with some external collaboration. And I'm going to show you exactly this one. But first, I would like to apologize for my voice. I got a nasty cold and it's very persistent. So please bear with me through this presentation. And with that, I can start. So as I mentioned, we are under this work is under the Sentinel project, which is a Horizon 2020 project providing modeling support for the European transition. And these are not all the models of the Sentinel framework, but are basically the models that participate in these exercises, which is Destiny, Calliope, Image, Hub, and Energy Plan. And we also were lucky enough to get Prometheus input to show as well. And first of all, I would like to convince you why and the comparison exercise is important. If Mark and Robert could not manage this yet, and then I will go through the methodology we used, then to the some of the results. We have a lot of results, but I think I picked some very aggregated ones. And then we'll skip to the conclusions and what our next steps will be. So, so the idea of the comparison analysis was to gather model results from IMC, but also energy models, which are actually models that have different sectoral and resolution, temporal resolution detail, but also sometimes different scopes. And we gathered these results, and other than, of course, the obvious benefit of having a big range of results showing future projection, we were also able to identify similarities and differences between the models, and through them to try to identify the strengths and weaknesses each model have, and respecting a specific sector. So further looking into it, we also tried to see how the differences in the methodological differences and the difference in technology, maybe in assumptions, actually led to the different outcomes you will see in a few minutes. But first of all, we needed some scenarios, and we have the current trend scenario as our baseline, which is actually already implemented policies for EU. And on top of that, we developed we use the climate neutrality scenario, which is a scenario in accordance with the European Commission target of at least 55% reduction by 2030 and climate neutrality by 2050. And on top of these two scenarios, we also use the modern interlinkages from Sentinel. And to try to explain it a bit, we identified possible linkages between the models of Sentinel, and based on the availability of the data, but also the need for the linkage to happen. And an example would be supply supply sector input to demand models. And we also included these linkages in this exercise. And this also helped with our slight harmonization we had, which is I'm sorry for that, which is harmonization of socioeconomic parameters of population and GDP. And to do that, we use growth rates from the EU reference scenario 2020. So having all of this combined, we have our first model results. But of course, this also means different output types, because each model uses its unique way to produce output. So we actually identified early on the need for a common template we could use. And for that reason, we created the tailor-made reporting format, and we call it Sentinel format. But it's a type of an IMC format similar to what EASA uses, but it's more useful for the needs of Sentinel, because, as I said, the models have different aggregation details. So we had to tailor-made what we can actually produce. And we populated an online free access database with all of these results. And here you can also find the link if you want to visit and see the whole range of the results we have. But for the report we actually had to pick a few of them. And this choice, of course, was based on the importance of key parameters, but also the availability of the results from the models, meaning that we opted for the options that most of the models could actually provide. And finally, as I mentioned, we reached out to external partners, so specifically Prometheus and PIPSA from E3 Modeling and Arcus, respectively, and they both responded positively. So we are likely to have Prometheus results already for the report, but we also will include PIPSA results in the coming paper. So having all of these aspects combined, we can finally go through the results, which we separated through demand sector and supply sector. And we'll start with the demand one. And specifically with the final energy consumption for Europe. And disclaimer here, Europe here is actually EU28 for most of the models, but for image Prometheus it's a larger region, and you can already see that in the historical values of 2050, where image has a bit higher values. And but other than that, you can see that the model projections are pretty similar, with a few exceptions, of course. So you can see that all models agree that under the climate neutrality scenario, the energy demand lowers, but at the same time, the electrification rates get higher. Also, an important observation is here you can see the district heating gets more and more important in the future. But for example, Calliope does not include it in its projection. And this is one of the differences we wanted to identify. Other than that, you can see that all models agree that in the fossil fuel phase out towards 2050, with an exception of image that keeps some of the fossils here, coupling them with CCS, and of course, a significant increase in renewable energy. And with that, I can show you the emissions from the demand side sector. And here, similar to the demand, you can see that the emissions projections are quite similar between the models. The exception here this time is image, where it has lower emissions already starting from 2050. And the reason behind that lies actually in the industry sector, where the feedstock emissions are calculated in a different way than the other models, resulting to lower emissions. And the other thing that all the models agree is that the transport and that the industry will be the hard to abate sectors. So you can see still relatively high emission in 2050 under current trends. But going to the climate neutrality, you can see that these emissions actually drop down almost to zero. And this is actually through the use of the higher electrification rates in combination with renewables and CCS for some of the models. So you can see that the desired neutrality for the scenario is achieved here, with maybe a bit higher emissions from Prometheus, but you will later see that it balances out with the supply side. And going to the supply side, here you can see the model results. On the left axis, you have the power generation, while on the right axis is the fossil fuel shares for the models. You can still see some similar results for most of the models, with the outliner being Calliope. And the reason behind that is its assumptions of the renewable use, where you can see in the current trends in 2050, it assumes almost zero fossil fuels, 0% fossil fuels, and when everything will be, all the power will be generated through wind and solar, a bit of nuclear, and a bit of hydro. And going to the neutrality scenarios, the differences get a bit larger between the models. We can already see very high electricity generation from Calliope, but from also energy plan. While same as the demand side, you can see that image still uses some fossil fuels, so you can actually see the fossil fuel share increasing instead of decreasing, but it's always coupled with CCS. And similar results with Prometheus, a bit higher fossil fuels, but coupled with CCS. And getting back to the power production from Calliope energy plant, the reason behind it is actually the assumptions on high hydrogen production by 2030. So most of this electricity is actually allocated to hydrogen production. And with that, we can go to the emissions from the power from the supply side. And here you can see the power generation emissions. So looking at the results already from 2015 under the current scenario, you can see that the external scenarios, meaning the official scenario and the reference 2020 scenario, are already higher than the others. And the reason behind that is that they also include some district heating emissions there. So it's not only power generation emission. And by the official scenario here, I actually mean combined results from a green plan for all and the 2030 climate target plan reports. And so another impressive difference we found out was the transition from Calliope from 2030 using almost only coal to 2050 using almost only natural gas, and almost achieving also neutrality in under current trends. But going to the actual climate neutrality scenario, you can see that all models could achieve climate neutrality with Image and Prometheus, which I think it's a bit over the slide. They both use BECS, so they go to negative emissions as well. And this, as I said, these are some of the results from Image, from the intercomparison analysis. So much more are included in the report, and some of them will also be included in the paper. So going to the conclusions from all of this experience we had is that combining different models is definitely challenging, and the challenge lies actually to the different sectoral details they have, but also different aggregation levels. So we had actually to figure out what's the best way to present the results, keeping all of this in mind. But also it actually comes with a lot of benefits as well, because in the end you have a framework of models that includes models that have very high details on a sectoral level, so they have probably better assumptions for technological costs, also maybe technological efficiencies per region, of course. But also you have models which are much less aggregated, much more aggregated, but less detailed, and you can still keep the element, some global elements like maybe global learning from global deployment of, let's say, renewables. So combining both of these elements, you actually get a much more robust result than having one or the other. Other findings that we had is also linked to what Robert said, the first presenter. I'm sorry. That as he said that the much more detailed model tend to have more renewables, and this is linked to what we found, that the more detailed models are actually much more flexible on the choices. So they can include more carriers like e-fuels, and then it can actually represent the energy system better. Finally, we found that all models agree that the energy demand is going down, but the power production will probably rise due to the high electrification rates, and this is something to consider, of course, with the energy crisis as well. Yeah. So for the further steps, as I mentioned, we are working on a paper which will be based on the presentation you saw today, which is the deliverable 8.3 of Sentinel. But we are also planning to improve on the analysis of the models, as now we have roughly found the reasons behind the difference, but we hope to dig much deeper on that. And on top of that, we are working also in the uncertainty runs as a next step, where we decided to harmonize the models in a much deeper level. So we decided to harmonize inputs from different sectors and see if the model result will converge or or something else will happen. And we are very interested to see what this will be. And that was all from me. Sorry again for my call, and thank you for your patience. And I will be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Stratos, and no worries for the call. Hope you get well soon. Thanks
Thank
a lot. And yeah, so it's great to see also different projects. I mean, with similar methods. So that's really great. So yeah, again, please raise your hand. I mean, speak up. Unmute yourself or write in the chat. Maybe I will start with one question. I think yeah, I mean some key findings were really similar to also Robert's presentation. That's I think really interesting, and some models are also the same. So I mean that maybe also might be interesting in the future once this categorization that Mark presented is kind of becomes more, let's say, salient, and we really can find this kind of key model characteristics. You can easily then also see if in other works how they can use. I have one question on the uncertainty that you mentioned in the future work. I mean that sounds interesting. What is exactly? I mean, what is the idea that what uncertainty dimension you wanted to look into? Because I mean there are many for sure. So yeah, I mean that I think can be a great extension if you know just what you thought how to implement uncertainty, because these models typically is not easy.
Yeah, so we call it uncertainty runs, but maybe it's better called harmonized runs because we are not going to have a sensitivity analysis or so. But the idea is to harmonize the input from each sector, some key input actually, not all the inputs, and see if this will actually solve the differences between the models or not. And this will be a way to see if it's a structural difference, so coming from the model type, or if it's assumptional or methodological difference. So that's the idea behind it. And then that would mean that we want to harmonize um, for example, the building sector, the industry sector, the transport sector, and then some elements from the supply side, which would be the load factors from wind and solar, and I think the investment cost as well. So we picked up these elements that we saw that would be interesting to harmonize, but that would also be possible to be harmonized because, as I said, the models are vaguely different between them. So we had to actually figure out how this would work, and in the end, we hope to see that the difference we saw already in the first experiment will get less. But yeah, that's to be found out soon.
Great. Yeah, that sounds interesting. Thanks. Any other questions for Stratos? I saw also mice before in the chat, so I think also this call for European scenarios is interesting because there, of course, all these models will be basically probably submitting runs, and so it will be also interesting to be seen what comes out of that process. I mean, which is not now, but I mean, it's in the end, it's a bit related, right? I mean, it will be similar model with a similar focus. So, so that yeah, I think all these questions that you raised are definitely relevant also to these kind of scenarios, a bit like IPCC, let's say, inspired of. So very useful, I think, this model comparison idea. Yes. So yeah, please feel free to use the chat to ask questions. And I think the Sentinel project has been very active in the past of the EMPE also. So it's great to see this works. I think there's also another session by that project. And we had originally 5 papers in this session. There was another one on a specific country. So far we looked at the EU, right? That was the analysis here. So we have, but that was unfortunately the speaker could not be here today. But we have one more presentation on Germany with a similar approach on multi-model comparison of different model types and models. So we had the first was the EU28, including UK in the works before, right? I mean, in your focus, it was Europe. It was the definition. I think I missed it at.
Yeah, so the definition was EU228, so
It's the same,
EU27
yes.
plus
Okay.
UK. But as I said, some models had a bit larger area, so including Switzerland, Norway, some other countries maybe.
Yes, there's also the regional definition issue at some point. We also saw that. So yeah, let's maybe then have first the last presentation, and then we can have the last open minutes for questions before the break. So let's move on to the next presenter. And I cannot see if I can see the chat here. Yes, so Felix Schreier will be the next presenter for work led by the Potsdam Institute on a model comparison study focusing on Germany. So, okay, we can see a slide. Perfect. Thanks a lot. And the floor is yours.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Can you see my slides? Is it in the correct
Yes.
mode, everything?
Yes. Perfect.
Okay, cool. Cool. Yeah, thanks for having me today. I'm going to present quite a similar exercise that we're doing on the European level, now on the German level. So there was quite a broad model intercomparison study on Germany's pathways to climate neutrality in 2045. And this is actually quite a large project involving different research institutes within Germany. Oh, sorry, I think this already. Involving different research institutes, and I'm just going to try to give you a brief gist of the core findings, and also will try reflecting a bit on the scenario process. As this is a session on multi-model comparisons. Now, the scenario work that I'm going to present is the core part of a comprehensive 300-page report on German climate neutrality pathways, which was published in October last year. And this was exactly the timing of the new German government negotiations. And so this report was quite well timed, such that researchers from our project could also give some impact in some input into the policy discussions. So first, a bit on Germany and what's the current status there, and what's the German ambition in terms of climate policy. So currently in Germany, the emissions reductions are at about -40% relative to 1990. And the most recent climate targets are to reach -65% and to get to climate neutrality in 2045. So 5 years earlier than the EU target already, which is quite a tight schedule. And here on the right side, you can see a bit what has happened to the emissions across different sectors over the past 30 years. And you see that the current reductions were mostly achieved in the energy supply side, so basically scaling up renewables in Germany. But on the industry, transport, and buildings side, not much has happened. And this is where really some acceleration is needed. And I mean, the other presentations in this session have shown that as well, where also now the research focus shifts to really spell out, okay, what does it mean for industry, for transport and buildings to reach these goals. Some quick facts about Germany that matter in this context. So Germany historically quite has some reliance on coal, first of all in the power sector, but then also coal use in industry. There's a concurrent phase-out of nuclear power. So in addition to the phase-out of coal power that Germany is planning, which again increases the short-term need for renewable scale-up. Germany has quite some energy-intensive industry, so steel, cement, and also chemicals. And Germany, of course, would like to green these industries in some way and to keep them in the country. However, like given the currently very ambitious climate targets, it's not entirely clear whether that whether that will be possible, or whether maybe some of the industries might need to replace. And finally, Germany has a relatively low negative emissions potential, lower than other regions of the world, in the sense that there's not much potential for land carbon sinks. And also not a very huge potential for CCS. So the technical potential for CCS is quite large, but if one looks at the actual discourse on CCS, there are issues with social acceptance of CCS in Germany, and there have also been legal issues in trying to enable this. So it's quite unlikely that like a very large scale CCS buildup can happen. So in that sense, Germany has quite a challenging task. First of all, to reach climate neutrality already in 2045, and then having these characteristics, which kind of increase the challenge to get there. Well, what did we do? So in this multimodal comparison project, first of all, we were thinking about a set of scenarios that we wanted to investigate, and we focused on different technology options, mainly with respect to hydrogen electrification. So we came up with 4 different scenarios and like a few variants of this, but the main scenarios are: there's a technology mix scenario, which has a balanced technology mix, which comes as a reference scenario a bit. Then we have a high electrification scenario, which is the 2A to B. Then we have a high hydrogen scenario and a scenario with a prioritization of synthetic renewable fuels, or e-fuels, you also call them. In addition, these scenarios come in variants, and sometimes why is this always, sorry, I have some issues with this presentation, but I think it's now fixed. Sorry for that. So these scenarios come in variants in the sense that we always run a variant with high renewable imports and variant with low renewable imports, and that means basically imports of green hydrogen or green synthetic fuels. And these scenarios were kind of harmonized. They were also harmonized assumptions on other things like biomass use, for example, or CCS use, so that we can really focus on the main questions and don't get distracted with kind of very different results. And this then was discussed with the modeling teams. That featured a couple of full system models, but also a couple of detailed sector models, like, for example, forecast for the industry or demo for the transport sector. And that basically led to our results, which of course needed some iterative process, as always, to where the models learned from each other and improved each other's results. The goals were basically improvement and learning, but also identification of robust insight and key uncertainties. So looking a bit now at the key results of this scenario work, here you see the emissions pathway, like illustrative of just one model, but one of the key messages of this report was that in order to reach climate neutrality in 2045, Germany basically needs to phase out all fossil fuels by 2045, because the negative emissions that are available, they are only sufficient to offset the residual non-CO2 emissions from agriculture and a bit from industrial processes. So in that sense, the energy sector, including transport, buildings, industry, and energy supply, really has to go to very low or basically zero emissions. And that's something that we also saw on the other models, and that shapes kind of the whole scenario exercise in a way. Now, how is this fossil-free energy system achieved? The key thing is that, like here you see again an illustrative figure from just one model. Like I will show some multi-model comparison figures soon, but here you can see that the electricity decarbonization is kind of the first step, which happens in the next 10 to 15 years. And then afterwards, it's about the non-electric energy, which also needs to become renewable. And that can happen in different ways. It can happen either by electrifying the current non-electric demands, by using hydrogen or e-fuels, or by using biomass. So here you can see the final energy mix now across the different models. And we always, for most of the plots, we chose kind of a focus model, and then we chose also did a panel with the multi-model comparisons. And here you can see that basically we have two types of scenarios, one scenario with electrification focus, one with a hydrogen focus. And if you look at the extent of electrification and hydrogen use, the models mostly agreed in kind of broadly speaking. And this, I think, is also a result of the discussions which were happening, for example, with the detailed sector modelers, where certain adjustments were made in each of the models to kind of get to a harmonized picture of that. So the results didn't look like this from the beginning. And the results were that there are some no regret electrification areas, for example, like light duty vehicles or low temperature heat in buildings or also in industry. And then there are some areas where you definitely need hydrogen in synfuels, for example, long distance transport and chemicals. And then there are some areas with uncertainties or competition, and that's, for example, parts of industry, if it's about medium temperature heat, or also HDV in transport. And this was spelled out in the different scenarios that we had. Now we can also look at the impact of these scenarios on the total electricity generation. And here you can see again the spread across models. And you basically see that electricity generation increases by 1.5 to 3 times relative to today. In the main models, there was also one model which kind of had very strong efficiency potentials, which got a bit to lower demand. But this is kind of the range we arrived at. And most of this electricity is provided by VREs. This is also quite a strong agreement across models. Hydrogen was typically used as a flexibilization option in the models to provide seasonal storage, either in the form of hydrogen or also in the form of synthetic methane. And in Germany, there was also this there is this quite relevant question of land scarcity in a way that many people are asking, okay, is it actually possible to build so much wind and solar? And I think there was also a very nice analysis here that much of the land that currently is used for bioenergy could be reattributed to wind and solar, such that the overall land that we use for renewable power production doesn't actually increase. I'm going to go a bit faster here. I think this is not so relevant. I just want to focus on one other thing, which is this. There was also a nice analysis that came out of the scenario exercise on the transformation up to 2030. So there's also this minus 65% 2030 target in Germany. And we were analyzing some milestones that need to be put on the ground, or that are consistent with our scenarios to reach this 2030 target. And the interesting thing is that these were numbers, the numbers that came out of this, that partly even made it to the German coalition agreement, which kind of increased the climate ambition targets or its numbers for the energy transition relative to the previous assessments. And here are some examples of that. So, for example, the scenarios show that there needs to be a coal phase out or almost zero coal in the power sector by 2030, and the German coalition treaty also took this up. I mean, meanwhile, given the current energy crisis, this is again a point in question, but it's at least something that was thrown into the debate. Then if you look at the renewable share in the power sector, here the models showed about a 65 to 80% share of renewables in power by 2030. And this is also basically what's in the new coalition treaty. And also battery electric vehicles. Here, our focus model for transport, the demo model, with about 15 million electric vehicles by 2030, is actually quite close with the now updated German government target. One other interesting analysis that came out of this is that we also looked a bit at the distribution of sectoral emissions to reach this 2030 target. There are official government targets for each sector, how much they have to reduce by 2030. And what this analysis shows, so this the gray bar is the official target, and then the colored bars, this is the focus model, and the ranges are from the other models. Overall, this picture tells you that the current sectoral targets aren't ideal, and that they're just a bit too tight in transport, and that they could be increased in the energy supply sector, so in the electricity, mainly in the electricity generation. This was also very interesting results, which I think was quite interesting for policymakers, that these targets might need adjustment if you look at it from a full system cost optimal point of view. I think I'm just gonna skip to the conclusion and try to wrap it up a bit. So on the results themselves, we were doing this multi-model scenario modeling and showed that it's basically possible to go to a fully renewable-based energy system in 2045, although the challenges are quite large. First of all, in absence of large CR potentials, you need to have a full phase out of fossil fuels. The main ways to do that are electrification and hydrogen. And they play different roles across the sectors. So in some sectors, electrification is more important. In others, you cannot get around hydrogen. And the next 10 years are going to be key for starting the transformation in key sectors. Maybe one general reflection on this whole process, I think, which was started about 2 years ago, was a tedious process to get all the model results in and into one, and to also agree on the same variable definitions. But in the end, it was quite fruitful because it enabled exchange across the modeling teams, enabled mutual learning, and also consolidated the results, which in the end is just also more credible to policymakers if we say, okay, like there are different researchers who sat together and came to a harmonized view on things. And I think here it helped that we have had the scenario exercise with a set of harmonized assumptions. Yeah, and I'm also very interested in your thoughts and how this is going to go forward on the European level with ECMF.
Thanks a lot, Felix. Great, very interesting study. I would like. I mean, the slide before looked really interesting. I mean, if you don't mind, you skipped it, but I thought it looked really interesting, at least to me. The one before the conclusion.
I can talk about it quickly if that's your question.
Yes. I mean, the sector results in general. I think that's really very interesting, but
that's that one.
Yes. So my question, if I may, so I jump in first. So here, so is so yeah, I'm a bit surprised to see that you basically have this too tight transport target as you mean it, given that typically, I mean, that's considered a bit more not less hard to abate sector than, let's say, some of the others. So I mean, do you have some intuition for that, or because from several other studies, transportation is usually less let's say, I mean, more flexible than let's say industry or to some extent buildings. So I'm surprised to see this. So you're suggesting that the target should be readjusted basically across sectors with an increase, with a reduction in transportation target. That is kind of the main message from this sectoral analysis.
Yeah, basically, yes. I think the main point is that if you look at the sectors as such, they obviously can't mitigate at the same pace. So you kind of shouldn't distribute the mitigation effort equally. And I think just in transport, they still chose a relatively high reduction target, which kind of doesn't account for the current status that we are in. And yeah, and the main takeaway here, I think, is that needs to be taken into account, so that you just shouldn't distribute that equally across sectors, but that you should account for that the energy supply sector actually can go faster than the others, and that you kind of need to have more time for the other sectors.
Right. Okay. Thanks. Yeah, one question in the chat. First, maybe quickly. Thank you. Where you may be looking at the flexibility need to ensure adequate security of supply at the higher shares of variable renewables. If so, what options do you see as most relevant? Question from Mikhail Domescu.
Yeah, this is a classical question. Unfortunately, I'm not an expert on VRE integration. Maybe you can ask Robert afterwards as well. But I think there's a separate chapter actually in the report on flexibilization and integration. There we actually have a separate model on this, like a detailed electricity sector model, which kind of did the analysis here. And I think what I can say from the full system models is that they usually represent or they usually have a parameterization of the integration challenges, the integration cost, and they include hydrogen and e-fuels as a storage option. So it's often parameterized in a way that you need to have some hydrogen storage at a certain share of VRE, but you don't have it in the sense that you really dispatch the hydrogen storage. Yeah, I think there's there's a. If you want to know the details about this, I think it's best to really look at the results of our sectorally detailed models. But we saw basically across models, I think every model had this, that either hydrogen or e-fuels played a role for flexibilization. I think that's a quite consistent thing.
Okay, thanks. Robert, next. Maybe I don't know if you want to come in on the integration or have your question on your own.
No, exactly. I wanted to come in on the integration part. So I think if you ask several different detailed models, they will give you different answers. And it's clear that you need a mix of or that a certain mix of batteries, a certain mix of transmission grid to get outside your local 500 to 1,000 kilometer weather patterns, and a certain mix of, in Europe, seasonal storage, because you have this very strong winter-summer seasonality is required. Like in this study, the Fraunhofer ECEMP people with their model did a number of different aspects they looked at. So it sadly the report, as far as I know, is only in German. but maybe some things can be well translated with Google Translate or something like that. I think they also looked at what's the additional demand we get from heat pumps, because I think that is one of the key challenges when you electrify a lot. In the northern part of Europe, you really get even stronger seasonality with high winter demands, and how strong that effect is. You can gain a lot of short-term, like few hours today flexibilities from heat pumps if you have a small storage, but you clearly need much more. You have much higher demand in winter than in summer, and so it's really this mix of demand, flexibility, and batteries for short-term, grids for covering weather patterns, and then hydrogen or other long-term storage to get over the seasonal challenges that you have in Europe.
I think, yeah, a bit related question by Hauke on the transport results, whether that is also reflecting the political progress in Germany, or is it more the technological assumptions driving this sectoral differentiation? So, I mean, did you take into account some kind of political, apart from maybe the, I don't know what is the base year calibration, but also some, let's say, short-term plans or policies?
Yes. So usually what we observe is that in the transport sector, there are additional policies needed kind of to speed up this transition. So kind of it's not only about carbon pricing, for example, but we assume in these scenarios that also other policies come on top, like, for example, the charging infrastructure build-up, and also that basically the transition to electric vehicles is fostered, for example, by premiums for car sales and things like this. So I think here we are already on a quite optimistic side, so that these things that they will still be done, and so it's not something that just kind of projects current trends into the future. If that was the question. Yeah.
May I add one
Sure.
point on that also? Like I think coming back to the initial question, like why transport is seen here as so difficult. I think this is really looking at the short-term scale up and the long limited reaction over the last decade. So I think it's really the detailed transport models. They take into account what are the current sales, how fast can you scale this up, what is the take-up rate by the different user groups, and so on. And then you really see 2040 you can get very low with electromobility, but simply the turnover of the fleet is not so fast, and the current availability of charging and so on limits how fast uptake will likely go up. And I mean, currently we have seen the reaction to very strong support policies, like 5,000 to 9,000 euros per car, and that gets you somewhere between 10 and 20% of sales shares. So that really gives you an idea of how fast take up will likely get until 2030. And even though you can get to 70, 80, 90% in sales, that still only gets you to 30% in stock. So that's why you still have a lot of emissions on the from the rolling stock, so to say.
Yeah, thanks. That answers my question. It was about, are the technologies just not there, or is it that politics has been sleeping and like getting going in a transition that just takes time? So
I would say the second one led to the first one, right?
Yeah, right. I mean, it's true. It's 2030 is the focus of all this analysis, so that's to be taken into account. Good point. Yeah, thanks. I think this is really a great example, this project and this presentation of how a model comparison exercise, taking different models with different, let's say, strengths or weaknesses or sector coverage, and then linking it very closely to government policies and even sectoral detail, like you can see here. I think that's really a very good example of a successful science policy let's say, linkage, right, or matching, which maybe at the EU level is not as easy always, because of course policies are a bit more maybe not, for instance, like at the sectoral level, easy to put in some analysis comparison like that. But yeah, I think it's really a very great example also how these model comparison exercises can be and are apparently, as you said, picked up also, including by the current government. So great to see, I think, and hopefully we're going to see more also at the EU level in the future and for other countries. Yeah, thanks a lot. So I don't know if there's any other questions or final comments. As said, I mean, the video, we will make it available also for people who maybe want to look it up afterwards. We had one last presentation, as I said before, so we are a bit have some minutes left. So I think we can also just close the session here. And well, thanks again to all the speakers and presentations and for the discussion. And looking forward to now in 4:30, there are 3 skills workshops that you can see all on the website if you're interested. And otherwise, see you tomorrow again at the plenary session. And well, thanks again, all the speakers, and have a nice rest of the day.